In my 35 years on the bench in Providence, I've seen anger, fear, pride, and heartbreak walk into my courtroom wearing ordinary clothes. But the morning a man stood before me expecting a $5,000 fine, I felt something different almost immediately. And if this touches your heart, leave a comment, because what happened that day reminded me why compassion belongs in justice. He thought he was about to lose everything. The truth was, I was only seconds away from hearing the one detail that would stop me cold and change the entire room. I remember the light in the courtroom that morning. It came through the windows in that soft Rhode Island way. Not dramatic, not harsh, just steady. Providence has a certain rhythm to it. The city wakes up with people carrying more than anyone can see. They come into municipal court with parking tickets, traffic matters, registration problems, overdue fines. On paper, these are small cases. But I've been doing this for 35 years, and I can tell you something, my friends. There is no such thing as a small case when it belongs to somebody living on the edge. Inspector Quinn was there, as always, with that calm face of his. He has seen thousands of stories unfold from a few feet away. Sometimes all it takes is one look from Quinn, and I know he's feeling the same thing I'm feeling. The prosecutor was organized, the clerk was ready, the room had that usual low murmur before I called the next matter. People shuffled papers. A woman in the second row was whispering a prayer under her breath. A young man near the back kept bouncing his leg so fast I thought the chair might snap. Then the clerk called the case. The defendant stood up slowly, like a man who had already lost the argument in his head before the hearing even began. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, but hardship had a way of adding years to his face. He had work boots on, scuffed badly at the toes. His shirt was clean but worn thin at the collar. His hands caught my eye right away. Rough hands, hands that worked, hands that had carried things heavier than they should have had to carry. He stepped forward holding a thick envelope, not a folder, not a neat file from a lawyer's office. An envelope, fat, bent, creased, clutched like it was the last thing standing between him and disaster. I looked down at the citation history and I understood why he looked the way he looked. Ticket after ticket, overnight parking, expired registration, failure to respond, late fees, additional penalties, administrative costs. One page became 2 pages, 2 pages became 3. The total was just under $5,000. Now let me ask you something. What am I going to do with you when you stand there with almost $5,000 in municipal violations hanging over your head and the look on your face says you haven't slept in months? I looked up at him and said, "Sir, say, Salvicatio sentalvidao or alvis." He cleared his throat. "Carlos Mendez, Your Honor." His voice was soft, respectful. No attitude, no cleverness, no rehearsed speech, just tired. I said, "Mr. Mendez, do you understand the amount that's due on these matters?" He nodded immediately, too quickly almost, like he had been bracing himself for the blow. "Yes, Your Honor, I know it's bad. There are people who come into court ready to fight before anyone says a word. There are people who want to blame the world, the city, the weather, their cousin, the mailman, anybody but themselves. I've heard every variation, but something in this man's eyes told me he wasn't here to perform. He was here because he had nowhere else to go." I said, "Did you bring that envelope because you have documents or because you have money?" He looked down at it, then back at me, and for a moment I saw embarrassment wash across his face. "Both, Your Honor." That got my attention. And before I tell you what was in that envelope, hit that like button if you believe in second chances, because too many people think justice has to be cold to be real. I don't believe that. Never have. I asked the clerk to read out the list. One by one, the violations came across the room. Several were from the same part of Providence, near the hospital district, a cluster of dates, then another cluster, then more. It wasn't random. It wasn't spread all over the city the way you'd expect if somebody simply didn't care. It was centered around one area, one narrow stretch of time, one repeated pattern. That matters to me. I pay attention to patterns. I said, "Mr. Mendez, these tickets are heavily concentrated near the hospitals." "Why?" He swallowed hard. "I parked there a lot, Your Honor." That was an honest answer, but not a complete one. I leaned forward. "I can see that. Let me ask you something. Why were you parking there so often? Were you working nearby?" He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. People do that when the truth is bigger than the question. Sometimes working, sometimes not. I said, "You'll have to help me understand that." He took a breath that sounded like it hurt him. "I work maintenance for a building company. Nights, mostly. Some jobs start early, but I was also going to the hospital. A lot." The room got quieter. Even the people waiting for their own cases stopped rustling around. I've learned that human pain has a sound in a courtroom. It's the sound of a room deciding to listen. I said, "Who was in the hospital?" He stared at the envelope. "My daughter. Now I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. I come from an immigrant family where children were not an accessory to life. They were the center of it. My own father worked long hours and came home with exhaustion in his bones, but if one of his children was hurting, he would have walked through fire barefoot to get there. So when a man says in that voice that he was going to the hospital because of his daughter, I don't just hear words. I hear the whole architecture of a family under strain." I said more gently, "How old is your daughter?" 9, Your Honor. 9. There are ages that land in the heart differently. 9 is one of them. Old enough to understand fear, young enough to still look for safety in your face. I looked at the dates again. Winter months, cold months, repeated visits, repeated parking in desperation. I said, "What was wrong with your daughter?" He opened the envelope, but not for money. He pulled out a photograph first. It was a small print, bent at the corners. He held it carefully like it was fragile. The bailiff brought it up to me. I looked at the picture and my heart sank. A little girl in a hospital bed, thin smile, brave eyes, tubes visible, stuffed animal tucked under one arm. I've seen that kind of smile before. "It's the smile children give adults when they don't want to scare them," he said quietly. "She had 3 surgeries in 11 months, Your Honor. Congenital heart condition, complications after the second one. We were in and out all the time. I had to pause for a moment. When you sit where I sit, people imagine your job is deciding what to do with violations. But some days the real job is controlling your own heart long enough to do justice properly. I didn't want pity to make me careless. I didn't want procedure to make me blind. I wanted the truth. So I asked more questions. I said, "Who was with her?" "My wife, me, my mother, when she could come." "And these tickets happened while you were taking care of her?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why didn't you answer them when they first came?" That's where many stories begin to crack, because the first explanation sounds reasonable and the second one reveals the weakness. But when I asked him that, he did not hesitate. "We moved." Just 2 words. I said, "Explain that." He looked over his shoulder for the briefest second, almost as if he hated saying this in public. "We got behind on rent while my daughter was sick. I was missing work. My wife was missing work. We moved out of our apartment. Notices were going to the old address for a while. By the time I caught up to all of it, the fines had gotten out of control." The prosecutor glanced at the file. The clerk looked down. Inspector Quinn gave me one of those looks that said, "This man's not spinning you." I asked, "Did you know at least some of these tickets existed while this was happening?" He nodded. "Some of them, yes." "And you still kept parking there?" He closed his eyes for a second. "Yes, Your Honor." That answer, more than anything, told me I was dealing with an honest man, because a liar would have made himself look perfect. An honest man admits the part that hurts him. I said, "Why?" He lifted his head. "Because I didn't know what else to do." There it was. That sentence has stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, not because it was polished, but because desperation often sounds exactly like that. Not loud, not eloquent, just simple, helpless, final. Let me tell you something, my friends. If you've ever had to choose between following a rule and getting to someone you love in time, you know the law can feel very different from the outside. Subscribe to see more stories from my courtroom, because the paper in front of me never tells the whole story until I ask the right question. I looked back down at the case history. Several tickets were issued overnight. A few were during visiting hours. Some were stacked so close together that it was obvious the vehicle, had barely moved. There barely sederi. Administrative penalties large enough to bury a working man. I said, What kind of vehicle was this?" "Yeah, my van, Your Honor, my work van." "If you lose the van, do you lose your job?" "Yes, that's another thing people don't always understand. A vehicle to some people is a convenience. To others, it is the thin line between feeding your family and falling through the floor of life." I said, "Are you still working?" "Yes, sir." "Is your daughter doing better?" He took another breath. "For the first time, there's you all." Flick. Light in his son's face. "She is. She's home now. Still needs follow-ups, but she's home." And the room exhaled a little with that answer. You could feel it. Then I asked him the question I always come back to in one way or another. "Mr. Mendez, why are you here today? Tell me the truth. Are you here asking me to erase this because life was hard? Or are you here because you want to do the right thing but you can't breathe under the amount?" He didn't answer with words at first. He opened the envelope wider and turned it so I could see inside. Cash. Bills folded every which way. 10s, 20s, 5s, some receipts, some paperwork, a money order stub, a rubber band around one stack. It wasn't neat. It wasn't symbolic. It was real money scraped together by sacrifice. He said, I brought everything I could, Your Honor. I sold some tools. I took extra shifts. My wife and I saved. My mother gave us money she should not have given. It's not enough, but I didn't want to come here empty-handed. That hit the room hard. You learn a lot about character from what people do before they stand in front of a judge. This man did not come in hoping to charm his way out. He came in trying to carry his responsibility even while he was drowning. I said, how much is in there? He named the number. It wasn't close to 5,000. It wasn't even half. But I could tell by the way he said it that every dollar in that envelope represented something his family had gone without. I've been doing this for 35 years, and I can tell you there are debts of money and there are debts of conscience. This man was trying to pay both. I asked him, who told you to bring that much? No one, Your Honor. And, then why did you? He looked at me with an expression I won't forget as long as I live. Because my daughter watches everything. I didn't want her to think her father runs from what he owes. Now my throat tightened. That is not the answer of a careless man. That is the answer of a father building a moral world for his child in the middle of chaos. I put the photograph down carefully and said, what's your daughter's name? Lucia. Does Lucia know you're here? He nodded. Yes, sir. She told me not to be scared. A little laughter moved through the room, but it wasn't humor exactly. It was tenderness trying not to cry. I smiled and said, that sounds like somebody who's already tougher than all of us. He smiled for the first time, just a little. Yes, sir. Then I asked to see the papers in the envelope. There were hospital appointment sheets, discharge summaries, a parking office notice, a change of address form, pay stubs, a handwritten budget on lined paper. And then something else, a note in a child's handwriting. The bailiff brought that up too. It said in big uneven letters, Daddy, please don't cry if the judge is mean. Maybe he had a hard day. I love you, Lucia. I looked at that note and thought, only children can say something so innocent that it reveals the whole moral condition of the adults around them. The room was absolutely still. I set the note down, took off my glasses for a second and said, well, I hope Lucia doesn't think I'm having a hard day. That got a needed laugh. Sometimes in a courtroom you have to let people breathe, but inside I was thinking of my own father. I was thinking of the immigrant life I grew up in, where dignity mattered as much as bread, where a man could be broke and still insist on honor, where family carried each other even when everyone was tired. My father taught me without speeches. He taught me by example. Show up, work hard, protect your family, tell the truth. Don't let hardship turn you into someone smaller. That's what I was looking at in front of me. And yet the law is still the law. That's where the real struggle begins for a judge who wants to be fair. If I ignored the facts entirely, I'd be dishonest. He parked where he shouldn't have parked. Repeatedly. Other people face emergencies too. Other families make sacrifices and still get tickets. If I became careless with mercy, mercy itself would lose its meaning. But if I treated those papers like math and nothing more, I would be committing another kind of injustice. Poverty is not a moral failure. A person is more than the worst paper filed against his name. And hardship does not cancel responsibility, but it does demand understanding. I turned to the prosecutor and said, Counselor, have you reviewed the date clusters on these violations? He said he had, briefly. I asked, do you see what I see? He leaned in and answered carefully, yes, Your Honor. A significant portion of the amount is from escalation and late fees, not the underlying violations. That mattered. I said, and do you have any objection to my examining whether multiple penalties here became disproportionate under the circumstances? He shook his head. No, Your Honor. Now, before I tell you what started forming in my mind, share this if you know someone who needs hope. Because hope isn't always a miracle. Sometimes it's a person in authority deciding to see you clearly. I asked the clerk to separate the original fines from the added penalties. The number changed dramatically, still serious, still painful, but not 5,000. Then I looked more closely at several tickets issued within a very narrow window, while the van was in essentially the same area near the hospital. I've seen enough of these cases to know when bureaucracy snowballs faster than common sense. I said, Mr. Mendez, during these periods, were you going in and out of the hospital overnight? Yes, sir. Were you leaving the vehicle there because your daughter was in surgery or in recovery? Yes. Did anyone advise you where to park for reduced rates or emergency family situations? No, Your Honor. I was just trying to be close. That sentence again. just trying to be close. You know, I've seen people come before me who wanted the city to reward their irresponsibility. This was not that. This was a father acting badly under pressure, yes, but for reasons that came from love, not indifference. Inspector Quinn shifted slightly and folded his hands. I know that posture. It means he's moved. I asked, did you ever explain this to the parking office? I tried, sir. They told me to come to court. Sometimes the system does what it can do, and that's all. But a courtroom, in my view, is where a human being is supposed to enter the process, not to destroy the rules, to rescue them from becoming cruel. I said, let me ask you something. If I gave you a chance to resolve the original responsibility in a way you could actually manage, would you do it? Yes, Your Honor, I would. How? Any way you say. I smiled a little. Be careful with that answer. What am I, your guidance counselor? The room laughed again. He laughed, too, nervously. Humor matters. Mercy without dignity can feel humiliating. Humor lets people remain human. I said, no, seriously. How would you do it? He told me his weekly take-home pay. He told me what his wife was earning again now that Lucia was more stable. He told me the rent. He told me the cost of medications. He told me about gas for the van and missed work days for cardiology visits. No self-pity, just facts. That, too, is a mark of sincerity. As he spoke, I noticed his wedding band had scratches all over it, as if he worked with tools constantly. I noticed the cuff of his shirt had been hand-stitched. I noticed when he mentioned his wife, he straightened up a little, proud of her. When he mentioned his mother giving him money, his eyes dropped, ashamed that she had to help. Details matter. There is truth in details. Something in their eyes told me they were telling the truth. That phrase gets overused, but I mean it literally. After decades on the bench, you don't become a magician. You become a listener. You hear what isn't spoken. You see where pride lives, where deceit hides, where grief interrupts the rhythm of a person's breath. I looked at the budget sheet again. At the bottom, in a different pen, someone had written, "Don't forget Lucia's blanket for appointment." That line broke my heart more than the medical records, because it revealed the life around the crisis, the errands, the blankets, the missed meals, the 1,000 tiny acts of love that never make it onto legal paper. I asked, "Where is Lucia now?" "At school, Your Honor." That surprised me. I said, "She's well enough for school?" "Yes, sir, not every day, but today, yes." "Good," I said. That's very good." Then just when I thought I understood the deepest part of the story, he told me something I didn't expect. He said, "Your Honor, there is one more thing." "There always is." I leaned back slightly. "Go ahead." He hesitated, and for the first time, he seemed truly afraid of being misunderstood. "I missed one of her appointments because of this van." I didn't speak. He went on. "I was afraid to drive it after I got the notice about the registration and all the tickets. I thought if I got pulled over, they would tow it. So I borrowed a car that morning, and the car broke down. We got there late. I never forgave myself." The courtroom went silent in a different way then. Even the air felt heavier. He wasn't asking me to save him from a ticket anymore. He was telling me he had turned the punishment inward. He had carried those fines like moral condemnation, like proof that he had failed at being the father he wanted to be. I said quietly, "Did the appointment get completed?" "Yes, sir. We were late, but they still saw her." "Good." Then I paused because what I wanted to say was not yet what I could say. I wanted to tell him no loving father should be reduced to that kind of shame by a tangle of paper. But I still had to do my job the right way. So I asked him one more important question. "Mr. Mendez, since this period, have you had any new violations?" "No, Your Honor." The clerk checked. "Clean. That mattered more than people realize. Mercy is strongest when it lands on someone who has already started correcting course. Let me tell you something, my friends. Justice should never confuse a person's worst season with their permanent character. If this story moves you, subscribe to see more stories from my courtroom, because the world needs reminders that accountability and compassion can live in the same sentence. I turned to the prosecutor again. "Would the city be served by insisting on the full escalated amount here?" He answered honestly, "Probably not, Your Honor." I appreciated that. Good prosecutors understand that government is not vindicated by crushing people pointlessly. I said, "Would the city be served by some recognition of the underlying violations while eliminating punitive excess?" "Yes, Your Honor." There it was. The legal door had opened just enough for justice to walk through. Now I want to explain something. People sometimes think compassion in court means throwing away the rules. No, real compassion requires discipline. It requires asking, what outcome protects the law, respects the public, recognizes the truth, and does not destroy a struggling family for no good reason? That is the work. And while all of this was unfolding, I could feel the eyes in that courtroom on me. Not because I was on television, not because people thought something dramatic might happen, but because everyone in that room understood, at least in part, what it feels like to fear a number on a piece of paper. $5,000 to some people is an inconvenience. To others it is a wall with no door. I thought of the many times I had seen families in Providence balancing impossible choices, rent or medicine, car payment or heating bill, work shift or school conference, registration fee or groceries. If you haven't lived near that edge, you may imagine people are just being irresponsible. Sometimes they are. But often they are triaging life, and that is what this man had done, not perfectly, not legally, but humanly. I look back at Lucia's note. Daddy, please don't cry if the judge is mean. Maybe he had a hard day. Children have a way of asking the adults in the room to become worthy of them. I said, Mr. Mendez, do you know why I asked so many questions? He shook his head. Because if I don't understand the life behind the violation, I'm not really judging fairly. I'm only processing. He nodded slowly. I continued. And I don't want to be a machine. I want to be a judge. He lowered his eyes and whispered, thank you. Then I heard something unexpected from the gallery, a woman softly crying. I looked over. An older woman, maybe his mother, sat with both hands clasped tight beneath her chin. He turned when he heard her. So that answered another question. He wasn't alone. I said, is that your mother? Yes, Your Honor. Would she like to stand? She stood carefully. Small woman. Worn coat, dignity all over her face. I asked, ma'am, do you speak English comfortably? A little, she said. I smiled. That's more than enough for this courtroom. The room warmed to her instantly. I said, you helped him? She put a hand to her chest. Family helps family. Now you're talking my language. I come from that world. That is immigrant scripture right there, not written in books, written in sacrifice. I told her, God bless you. She crossed herself. I'll never forget that moment. A courtroom in Providence, a mother crossing herself because somebody in authority said something kind to her son. That is not softness, that is civilization. I asked Carlos, did your mother give you money from her own savings? He nodded. She spoke up before he could answer. For granddaughter, for him. Money comes back, family maybe not. If that didn't move you, you weren't made of the same material as the rest of us. The prosecutor looked down for a second. Inspector Quinn cleared his throat. Even the clerk had that expression people get when they are trying very hard to stay composed at work. And then I thought of my own health journey. There are things life teaches you when you've been forced to look mortality in the face. You stop believing that authority is about control. You understand it is about stewardship. You are here for a little while. What will you do with the power that passes through your hands? That thought came to me strongly that morning, because I knew that whatever I said next would not only affect a balance sheet, it would become part of how that family remembered the world. Was the world merciless when they were weakest, or did it leave them one place where truth mattered? Before I tell you what I decided, hit that like button if you believe a courtroom should make room for humanity. Not excuses, humanity. I leaned forward. Mr. Mendez, listen carefully to me. He straightened immediately. You were wrong to park illegally, repeatedly. Do you understand that? Yes, Your Honor. You don't get a free pass on every bad choice just because the reason was painful. Yes, sir. But, I said, and I let that word sit there, the purpose of the law is not to take a struggling father and finish him off. He looked stunned. I continued. The purpose of the law is to guide conduct, protect order, and where possible restore people to responsibility. I see a man who has already learned the lesson. I see a father who is trying to stay close to his child. I see a family that is paid in ways no ledger can capture. His face changed then. Not relief yet. Hope, the more fragile thing. I said to the clerk, mark the duplicate and excessively escalated matters for dismissal where appropriate. Remove the late fee pileup that turned this into an unpayable burden. The clerk began noting items. Carlos looked like he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. I kept going. As to the underlying responsibility that remains, I am reducing this matter to an amount this court considers just under these circumstances. I named the number. It was low enough that the room gasped, not because it was nothing, because it was possible. His hand went to his mouth. I said, well, on end, now listen. You brought more money than that today, didn't you? He nodded, unable to speak. Good. Then you can pay that reduced amount and walk out of here free of this. He just stared at me. I said, you heard me correctly. That is when the tears came. Not dramatic sobbing, just a man whose body had been holding tension so long that mercy felt physically confusing. He lowered his head and one hand gripped the edge of the podium. His mother started crying openly. The room was no longer pretending not to feel things. I could have ended it there. Many judges would have. It would have been enough. A strong moment. A fair result. But then I looked at the photograph again. I looked at the note. I looked at the envelope of family sacrifice, and I asked myself a harder question. How much justice had already been collected from this man outside the courtroom? I said, Mr. Mendez, how much of that envelope belongs to your mother? He named the amount. I said, and how much of it came from selling work tools? He told me. I turned to the clerk. What is the exact balance remaining after the lawful reductions? The clerk stated it. I looked at the numbers, then I looked at him, and I made the choice that people later told me they could not believe. I said, sir, pay a token amount today. A token amount. The rest, I'm remitting. The room erupted, not in chaos, in stunned relief. He looked up as if he hadn't understood English anymore. I repeated it. A token amount, that's all. The rest is remitted. He said, why? That question came from so deep in him it almost sounded like a child's voice. I answered him the only way I knew how. Because your daughter needs a father more than the city needs to make an example out of a good man having the worst year of his life. That line spread far and wide later. People quoted it back to me, but I wasn't trying to be quotable. I was simply telling the truth, as I understood it in that moment. I added, take the rest of that money and bring it home. He began shaking his head in disbelief. I pointed gently. Bring it home. Buy Lucia something nice. Maybe not too expensive, I said, and the courtroom laughed through tears, because I still expect you to be responsible. That broke the tension just enough. Then I said something I meant with all my heart. Mercy is not weakness. Mercy is strength with a heartbeat, and today this court has the strength to see you. I noticed the prosecutor nodding. That mattered to me too, because compassion is most powerful when it is shared by the institutions around the person, not just performed by one judge. Carlos finally found his voice. Your Honor, I don't know what to say. I smiled. Then say thank you to your mother. Say thank you to your wife. Say thank you to whatever grace got your daughter through surgery. And then go home and keep doing the right thing. He turned toward his mother. She was crying so hard she had to cover her face. I said, and one more thing. He looked back. Don't ever let hardship convince you that you're a bad man if you're still standing there trying to honor your obligations. A bad man doesn't come to court with an envelope of sacrifice and a child's note. That is one of the truest things I've ever said from the bench. He nodded again and again. God bless you, I told him. He whispered, God bless you too. Then I said, take care of yourself and take care of Lucia. He answered, I will. Now, if you believe people should be judged by more than their worst paperwork, leave a comment below. I read the hearts behind those comments even when I can't read every single word. The hearing could have ended there, but the best moments in life often keep unfolding after the official decision. As the clerk processed the token payment, Carlos turned back one more time and said, Your Honor, may I ask one thing? I said, yes. Can I call my daughter? I laughed. In the courtroom, we'll all end up on the phone with her. The room laughed with me. Then I said, go ahead, briefly. He stepped aside, dialed, and when the little girl answered, he could barely get the words out. He told her they were okay. He told her the judge was not mean. He told her they were going to keep the van. He told her maybe they could stop for ice cream on the way home if her mother said yes. That is when even people in the gallery who had nothing to do with the case started wiping their eyes. There is something beautiful about hearing fear turn into relief in real time. It changes the sound of a person's voice. He handed the phone to his mother for a second. She said a few words in Portuguese through tears. Family language, the language of survival. Inspector Quinn looked over at me with the smallest smile, the kind that says, this is why people trust you. But let me be honest, I don't sit there trying to create moments. I'm not directing a scene. I'm doing what I believe a judge is supposed to do. Listen carefully. Discern honestly. Apply the law firmly. And when there is room for mercy, don't be afraid of it. That case would later be watched by millions through Caught in Providence. People from all over the world would write that they cried, that they called their parents, that they finally understood what compassionate justice looks like. I'm grateful for that. But in the moment, I wasn't thinking about television. I was thinking about a little girl named Lucia and a father who needed to leave my courtroom able to breathe. After the matter was finished, I sat for a moment before calling the next case. That happens sometimes. A case leaves an imprint. I looked down at my notes and wrote a phrase in the margin. The law is a compass, not a club. I believe that. If I can use the authority of the court to point a person back toward dignity while still holding them accountable, then I have done something worthy of the robe. The next few cases went on: a traffic light violation, a parking meter dispute, a registration issue. Court moves that way. Human drama, then ordinary procedure, then another burst of human drama. But I kept thinking about Carlos, because behind every legal outcome is a moral question. What did we teach this person about society? Did we teach him that institutions are deaf to context? Or did we teach him that truth, responsibility, and humility still matter? Late that afternoon, after the docket ended, Inspector Quinn came over to me. He does that sometimes when a case carries unusual weight. He said, "That one got to everybody." I said, "You can tell." I smiled at him. "Sometimes if it doesn't get to me, I worry." He said, "That's why people come here hoping." That line stayed with me. People don't come to court because they enjoy it. They come because some part of life has tangled itself around them. But they also come quietly, secretly, hoping there is still a human being at the center of the process. Weeks passed. Then one day, among the letters and notes that make their way to chambers from time to time, there was an envelope addressed in blocky handwriting. No law firm return address, no polished stationery, just a family letter. Inside was a photograph. Lucia standing beside the van, smiling big this time, stronger, holding an ice cream cone. On the back someone had written, "She picked mint chocolate chip because she said it looked like hope." I don't mind telling you that nearly undid me. There was also a note from Carlos and his wife. They thanked the court. They said the reduced burden had allowed them to catch up on medication and travel expenses for follow-up appointments. They said Lucia had gone back to school more regularly. They said Carlos had purchased back one of the tools he had sold. They said his mother still cried whenever she told the story. And then there was a line from Lucia herself. "Dear Judge, thank you for not having a hard day. Tell me that doesn't make you laugh through tears. I brought that note home. My family knows that. Some cases stay with me. You cannot sit where I sit and not carry people with you. Not every case, not every day, but some. My children grew up with me, talking about dignity, about fairness, about the responsibility that comes with power. I never wanted them to think being a judge was about being obeyed. I wanted them to understand it was about being worthy of trust. That case was one of those lessons. This reminds me of my father in a very specific way. He didn't have a robe. He didn't have a bench, but he had moral clarity. He understood that when someone is trying with all they have, you don't humiliate them for not having more. You help them stand straighter. You preserve their dignity while correcting their course. That is not leniency. That is wisdom. Too many people think the opposite of cruelty is weakness. It isn't. The opposite of cruelty is courage. It takes courage to be fair in full color, not just black and white. And I want to say something else, because this matters. Compassion does not mean everybody gets out of consequences. Absolutely not. I've told many people, "You did wrong and you're going to pay." I've said, "What am I going to do with you?" and meant it. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is stop enabling denial. But when someone walks in honest, burdened, accountable, and clearly trying to do right, the court should know how to recognize that too. If this story speaks to you, share this if you know someone who needs hope. We live in a time when people are hungry for proof that decency still exists in public life. Months later, I heard that clip had gone around everywhere. People sent it from one family member to another. Teachers showed it. Pastors mentioned it. Nurses wrote about it. Fathers wrote to me. Mothers wrote to me. People who had never stepped foot in Rhode Island knew the name of a little girl named Lucia because one courtroom in Providence decided not to treat suffering like a billing opportunity. That humbles me, because none of us should need a viral clip to be kind. But if a viral clip reminds us to be kind, then I'm grateful for that too. I saw Carlos once more after that, not in the same dramatic way. He came back to court months later, not as a defendant this time, but because he had another matter to straighten out involving paperwork on the van. Nothing serious, everything in order. He waited until the session ended and then approached respectfully. He looked different, lighter, still tired because life with a recovering child is not easy, but lighter, like a man no longer carrying a boulder on his chest. He said, "Your Honor, Lucia wanted me to tell you she got Student of the Month." I said, "Student of the Month, and she's moving ahead of all of us." He laughed. I asked, "How is she really doing?" He said, "Better, stronger. She talks too much now." I pointed at him. That means she's healthy." He smiled and said, "Yes, sir." Then he did something that I will never forget. He said, "You know, I came here that day thinking I was a failure. I left thinking maybe I was just a father having a hard time." There are no words from the bench more valuable than hearing that, because that is exactly the correction I hoped the case would make, not just financially, spiritually, morally. A man should be accountable for conduct, yes, but he should not be defined forever by the season in which he was struggling to survive. I told him, "You were never the sum of those fines." He nodded, and I could tell that line mattered to him. Then I said, "But remember something. Mercy is an invitation, not an exemption. Keep your affairs in order. Set the example for Lucia." He answered immediately, "I will, Your Honor." "You're a good person," I told him. His eyes filled again, and he looked away quickly. Men of a certain kind do that when emotion arrives. Not because they don't feel deeply, because they do. "Thank you," he said. "God bless you," I replied. That's not a throwaway phrase when I say it, I mean it. I mean, may grace meet you where institutions often fail. May your family have enough. May your burden lighten. May your children outrun your fears. After he left, I sat there for a long minute. I thought about all the people who never make it to a courtroom where someone listens carefully. All the families buried under fees and penalties that begin as minor mistakes and become impossible mountains. All the times a little intervention at the right moment can preserve a job, a car, a home, a child's sense of safety. The law must maintain order. Of course it must. But order without humanity turns brittle. Justice without mercy becomes administration. And administration alone cannot heal a city. Providence taught me that. My parents taught me that. The people who stand in front of me every day teach me that. Sometimes viewers ask me, "Judge, how do you know when to help?" I tell them I look for several things. I look for truthfulness. I look for humility. I look for patterns in the facts. I look for what happened before the person arrived. I look for whether they are learning or simply manipulating. I look at the eyes. I listen to the pauses. I examine the documents. When I looked at the parking tickets, I saw the dates. When I asked to see the medical bills, my heart sank. When I read the note from Lucia, I saw the entire moral picture. Evidence matters, intuition matters, experience matters, and conscience matters most of all. I do not claim perfection. No judge should. We are human beings trying to do a human job under legal constraints. But I try to treat people the way I'd want to be treated if I stood where they stand. Not indulged, not humiliated, heard. That is the key. Heard. A courtroom can be the loneliest place in the world if nobody hears you. Or it can be the place where your life gets stitched back together just enough to keep going. Carlos expected me to say the kind of words people fear from authority, "Pay it all." Too bad. Not my problem. Next case. Instead, the words that came out of my mouth were words he never expected to hear. "Bring that money home." I can still see his face when I said it. Shock, relief, disbelief, then gratitude, the kind that has no performance in it. And I remember thinking, this is why I still love the work after all these years. Because even now, after decades on the bench, human beings can still surprise me with their resilience, their honesty, their love for one another. A little girl with a heart condition worried that the judge might simply be having a hard day. A grandmother ready to give away her savings without complaint. A father bringing every dollar he could gather rather than teach his daughter that responsibility can be avoided. Tell me that isn't a lesson in citizenship more powerful than any speech. If you believe justice and mercy can coexist, hit that like button. Not for me, for every overburdened family trying to keep its dignity in a hard world. I want to leave you with this. Some people think a judge's most important tool is punishment. I don't. I think it is discernment. The ability to know when firmness teaches best and when kindness does. The ability to see that everyone has a story, but not every story excuses conduct. The ability to separate manipulation from sincere struggle. The ability to remember that public trust is built one fair decision at a time. That day in Providence, Rhode Island, in a modest municipal court that handles the kinds of cases many people dismiss as minor, I was reminded again that small cases are often carrying the biggest hearts. One stack of parking tickets turned into a lesson about fatherhood, immigrant values, family, loyalty, and the purpose of mercy. One frightened man expecting a $5,000 fine walked out with a chance to keep his life together. One little girl learned that authority can be kind, and one courtroom full of strangers remembered for a few minutes that we belong to one another. That matters. It matters more than ratings. It matters more than headlines. It matters more than being right in the narrowest legal sense. Because at the end of a life, nobody says, "I wish the institutions had been colder to me when I was trying my best." They remember who saw them, who listened, who gave them a way back. I've been doing this for 35 years, and I still believe the same thing. When hardship knocks a person down, justice should not step on their fingers. It should offer a hand when the law allows it, and it should do so without surrendering truth. That is how I try to live. That is how I try to judge. That is how I honor the people who raised me and the city that trusted me. So tell me what you would have done if you were sitting where I was. Would you have enforced every dollar, or would you have seen the Father standing behind the file? Leave a comment and let me know. And subscribe to see more stories from my courtroom, because every day in Providence there is another reminder that people are more complicated, more fragile, and more worthy of compassion than their paperwork suggests. As for Carlos, Lucia, his wife, and that faithful mother of his, I still think of them. I still picture that note. I still hear that little sentence in my mind. Maybe he had a hard day. Well, that day I did not. That day I had the privilege of watching mercy do what money never could. God bless you. Take care of yourself. And remember this: for the next time life puts someone frightened in front of you, the most unbelievable words are often the simplest ones. I understand. But nothing prepared me for what walked into my courtroom next.